and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Saudi Arabia has appointed a new crown prince and unsuccessfully pressured Qatar so far to cut back ties with Iran. With the proxy war in Syria winding down, are the two Middle East regional powers heading towards dialogue or a new war front? China's top diplomat met President Trump in Washington. Although China and the U.S. have their differences, their common goal of peace on the Korean Peninsula overrides other issues. I speak with Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass to find out how the two countries can cooperate. The diplomatic crisis in which several countries cut ties with Qatar has entered its third week. U.S. President Donald Trump has remained friendly to both sides of the political showdown by resuming joint military exercises with Qatar on the one hand and by phoning Saudi Arabia's newly appointed crown prince on the other. This is a far cry from the start of the crisis when Trump labeled Qatar as a founder of terrorism at a very high level. Is the American attitude towards Qatar changing, or were Trump's initial statements just misinformed?
Situation changed. President Donald Trump called Saudi Arabia's new crown prince as the U.S. stepped up efforts to mediate a crisis between Qatar and America's closest regional allies. This call comes after Saudi Arabia's King Salman appointed his 31-year-old son Mohammed bin Salman as crown prince. They have already developed a working rapport. The two men have met in Washington earlier this year, and the relationship was further enhanced as Trump gave the kingdom the honor of being his first state visit. This made Trump the first U.S. president to make a Muslim country the destination of his first official trip. Also, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries issued a list of demands to end the crisis, insisting that Qatar shut down Al Jazeera, cut back diplomatic ties with Iran, and sever all ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. However, Qatar rejected the demands as interference in its foreign policy, which Qatar considers non-negotiable.
Now, the situation in the Arabian Gulf over the last few days is troubling to the United States.
The tensions were raised by the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including Saudi Arabia, when they cut ties with Qatar earlier this month, accusing it of funding extremism and cozying up to Iran. Now it seems that this dispute threatens to disrupt efforts to defeat the Islamic State group and counter Iran. Whether the tensions can be eased in the immediate future remains to be seen, especially if hopes are resting on President Trump to bring that peace.
To further discussion about what is going on right now, we have in our Beijing studio Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Meanwhile, join us in Washington, D.C., Jonah Blank, who is a senior political scientist from the RAND Corporation. Welcome to both of you, and we are hoping to have a Middle East scholar joining us later in our program. Let me begin with you, Mr. Blank. What do you make of this transition of choosing one and then the other as the possible king for the future?
Well, I think that Saudi Arabia, and particularly King Salman, are trying to make a big change in the policy. Saudi Arabia has traditionally been governed by a gerontocracy, ruled by a collection of princes in their 70s and 80s. So I think this is an attempt to get ahead of demographic curves and position Saudi Arabia for the 21st century.
Position Saudi Arabia for the 21st century. What kind of Saudi Arabia would that be, Mr. Li? This young prince is well known for being aggressive and tough. And also, he is very much publicized in the media almost every day. So what kind of leadership are we seeing this choice by the king?
I think, so far, the junior and Salman, the crown prince, he seemed to be very ambitious. And he got a sort of vision, which is called 2030 vision for the Saudians. And he also introduced some of the reforms, and also I think he tried to promote some of the things which are very much enjoyed by the young people.
Like what?
for example, he introduced sort of Western sort of entertainment and also calling for the rights for the women and this kind of social reforms. But ever since he introduced this kind of reform so far, where people have not seen any visible progress yet. And he also has been called by his critics is very impulsive, reckless, but he is also, and called by his supporters, he is very energetic, very determined, and he can make a kind of decision.
A lot of adjectives over there. What we need to have is more verb, probably. So, Mr. Blank, let me ask you. I mean, this crown prince is well known for having argued for, at least, a bigger role for women in the economic life. He's also very active in terms of what Mr. Lee just earlier talked about, the so-called Western lifestyle. But at the same time, he talked about Saudi Arabia should get rid of the dependence totally on oil. He also talked about very strong role of Saudi Arabia in the region. Even some suggest he was one of those behind the wars in Yemen. So analyzing all of this, what kind of Saudi Arabia do you think now the current king is trying to cut out with this choice of this crown prince?
I don't think that King Salman actually knows what Saudi Arabia is going to be like in the future. Let's remember that King Salman is in his 80s.
Right.
I think that he recognizes, however, that the old model, that is reliant almost entirely on an oil-based economy and resting on a bargain with the conservative and very traditionalist clergy to keep the royal family in power, I think he realizes that this bargain in this model is not going to be successful in the 21st century. Qatar and the UAE have already moved, or are in the process of moving, to a new model that is more internationalist, more open to other outside influences, while still maintaining absolute control by the ruling houses and dynasties. That, I think, is what King Salman wants to get to, but I don't think he has a very clear picture of how to do it.
Right. Mr. Lee, from your perspective, we have seen some very dramatic movements in the region, the Gulf countries, over the past few weeks. On the one hand, there's a different choice of the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, which is a big thing, of course, for the region, because it's about the future. On the other hand, there's also some current geopolitical struggle among the countries in the Gulf region. For example, Saudi Arabia, together with UAE, vis-a-vis, let's just say, Qatar. And today, the news came out suggesting there has been a list of demands coming from Saudi Arabia, UAE, toward Qatar, if the latter wants to mend defenses with the former, including severe tie with Iran, get rid of military bases in Qatar by Turkey, and also there's also talk about should be getting rid of the media organization, Al Jazeera. Of course, different sides say different things about these leaks, but it seems that most of them have been true. So, Mr. Lee, it's a long question, but I want to ask you, how do you read all of these moves all at the same time, very much close to one another? This is relatively a quiet place in terms of countries toward one another, but now you see so much movement just within a couple of weeks.
I think this is largely, as many even the UAE foreign minister has admitted, and because they have got the encouragement from U.S. President Donald Trump's Middle East visit, and those peoples and encouraged by the Trump to take the actions, try to first to form a kind of anti-Iran coalition. Then they would take sort of actions to try to eliminate or to reduce the influence of Iran.
Right.
And they believe that for them this is historical opportunities, because during the last 80 years, because Obama's the attitudes for Iran, they could not do it. But Trump coming, Trump is in the line of Saudis.
Is that really a window of opportunity? People have a far different worldview, some say, particularly if you compare the last U.S. president and the current one, Barack Obama, for example, and Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's strong public endorsement of Riyadh as his primary regional partner may have emboldened the Saudis, some say, and changed some of the geopolitical math. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations like the United Arab Emirates were deeply suspicious of Obama's diplomatic détente with Iran, which culminated in the year 2015 nuclear deal. Of course, those a comparison, but the question is, Mr. Blank, U.S. as the power in the world, particularly in the Middle East, has to play its balance very well. Do you think President Trump, with his last trip made to Saudi Arabia, has managed to do that, or actually giving wrong messages, or at least exaggerated messages, to those in the region?
Well, I think that there are a lot of mixed messages coming out of Washington. The administration is just getting its sea legs right now, and I think that there is a lot of concern in the region about what is the U.S. position going to be vis-a-vis Iran. Will there be a wholesale change of policy? Will there be a renunciation of the nuclear deal? If there is no renunciation of the nuclear deal, will there be a rethink of the U.S. policy towards ISIS, which is, of course, the sworn enemy of Iran and also the sworn enemy of the United States? Saudi Arabia is trying, I believe, to leverage this uncertainty for its own policy goals, which, as you quite rightly point out, are lining up a Muslim alliance against Iran. And from Saudi Arabia's perspective, it would very much like this to be a Sunni alliance versus Shia Iran.
Mr. Blank, I want to go a little bit further. I mean, all of us have heard and read and watched the information related to what happened during the September 11th terrorist attack and who were behind them, those terrorists in the incident. And there have been, as a result of that, quite a cold period between the United States and Saudi Arabia, reflected during the Obama administration. So now, how well and seriously has the U.S. done its research about who to deal with and who to work with in order to tackle ISIS and also the root causes of terrorism, or at least some of the root causes of terrorism?
Well, I think the U.S. has certainly done an extensive amount of research. We at RAND do nothing but research, and many of our colleagues throughout the country and throughout the academic establishment have looked at exactly this question. But it's a very, very complex issue, because Saudi Arabia has been not only one of the prime partners of the U.S., but also a partner of groups that are not necessarily friendly to the U.S. And a lot of the root causes that fueled not only 9/11, the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of ISIS, but the Arab Spring, which was a peaceful expression of some of the same discontents. These same frustrations have expression throughout the region, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in UAE, in Egypt, and in many other countries. What we do with that, the United States, China, Saudi Arabia, that is a much longer and more difficult question.
Interesting. Mr. Lee, your input here?
I think if we take what Trump said during his campaign, and actually he is not so friendly, and I would say that he was criticizing the Saudi the policies, especially its position on the anti-terrorism. And this is what I would say that the achievements of the Saudi Arabians after Trump, to become the U.S. president. They, Saudians, successfully, changed, Trump's position instead of, very, anti-Saudi, not to become, a Saudi very close alliance. Some people say that, more than, $100 billion US dollars may, have sort of effect which, help the Saudians to change, Trump's position. Yes, I think a part of that. But still, I believe, Saudi and the US, they share the same goals. For example, the Iranians, they also try to, diminish the influence of Iran in the world.
Right.
I think this is a very important, the common position of the two sides.
But as we know, Mr. Lee and some of the other gentlemen joining us right now, priorities of countries change when things happen. So let me go to in Doha, Ibrahim Farhat, who is a conflict resolution professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Mr. Farhat, welcome to our program. I want to have your views about whether it's likely to be sustainable for Trump administration this time, at least at the very beginning of it, to have its continued or even better relations with Saudi Arabia to begin with. Is it likely to be sustainable, given the priorities that the U.S. might be dealing with in the near future?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I highly doubt that this relationship is sustainable. We are seeing that the relationship is struggling from day one with the first crisis that's erupting in the region. We have seen a clear division within the U.S. administration between the establishment that more in support with the traditional position of allying with their traditional or supporting their traditional allies, in this case not only Saudi Arabia and the UAE but Qatar as well. And on the other hand, we are seeing that the Trump administration more signaling towards the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So this clear division has been sustained. That's the only sustainable thing that we're seeing. And it's not the only division actually within the US administration and the establishment, because we have seen before actually the division within the judicial system and the Trump administration, where when the Trump started the ban against Muslims, the judiciary opposed that decision, and the struggle is continuing on that level. So we are seeing another battle between the White House and the establishment in the United States, now this time over the crisis in the Gulf and the support to Saudi Arabia from the White House, while the establishment is opposing this. I think this whole relation, yes.
So, Mr. Farhat, are you suggesting that the internal politics in Washington might be spilling over to the overall strategy that the Trump administration might be having in the Middle East? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, actually, I think the internal politics are key here, and it's not actually it's making the situation worse, because there is an absence of a U.S. role, an absence of a clear U.S. role in this crisis that should actually be pushing to peacefully end the crisis rather than exacerbating the crisis.
Right. Mr. Blank.
Actually, I think that the crisis...
Mr. Blank, if I could go to you, which is, there has been so-called America First. There's also talk about whether Trump administration is about American isolationism, and there has been too much role U.S. played in the Middle East, and now it's probably too little role. Whether you're coming from whichever camp, but there seems to be a debate going on about what is likely to be the future of the United States and the Middle East, particularly, Mr. Blanca, the shale gas. You have developed that technology in the U.S., making sure you're not going to be anymore that much dependent on the Middle East for the natural resources and oil. So what would all of this mean?
Well, good question. The U.S. has been trying to disengage from a lot of the quarrels in the Middle East for some time. President Obama tried what was first called a pivot to Asia, then a rebalance to Asia. The current administration talks about America first and pulling back from commitments, and yet when one is a superpower, one really has very little choice but to stay engaged. Mr. Farhad is absolutely right that the U.S. should, in my view at least, be trying to resolve this dispute between its partners, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, rather than simply standing back and letting a very dangerous situation become even more perilous.
When you say U.S. should step in, which side to step in and do what? Do you think the Trump administration is going to follow your advice?
Well, I
Mr.
don't
Blank?
think the U.S. should take sides in this. I don't think the U.S. should take sides. I think the U.S. should simply use its offices as a friend of both nations to bring about a peaceful resolution. If the U.S. were to side with either Saudi Arabia or Qatar, it would be, I think, very bad for the region and indeed for the world.
Right.
The U.S. is already, in my view, trying to do this. The fact that there are military exercises with Qatar is a very strong signal to Saudi Arabia that the U.S. is not simply walking away from its partner in Qatar. And
All right, and
the likelihood of the U.S. abandoning Saudi Arabia is, I think, completely unlikely.
All right. We only have 25 seconds left for you. Unfortunately, Mr. Farhad, let me ask you, there are so many things going on in the Middle East. You have the U.S. foreign policy, very different in the region. You have the younger generation, the Crown Prince we just talked about, coming up into the leadership. You also have the world dramatically changing. What kind of Middle East are we looking at and will be looking at in the near future? Very general question, but I need to have your vision, Mr. Farhad.
Well, in less than 25 seconds, as you said, I think it's going to be way more dangerous, unfortunately, than what we saw before during the past 5 years. I think we're heading into a stage of new confrontations in the region, and this is going to result in more chaos in the region, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, we're going to see what's going to happen. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Li Guofu, Ibrahim Farhad, and John Blank. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program. China's top diplomat met President Trump in Washington. Although China and the U.S. have their differences, their common goal of peace on the Korean Peninsula overrides other issues. I speak with the President of Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, to find out how the two countries can cooperate. His prescription, at least. U.S. President Donald Trump has met with China's State Councilor Yang Jiechi at the White House. Yang is in the United States to attend the first China-U.S. diplomatic and security dialogue. The 2 days of meetings focused on the DPRK. Although some disagreement between China and the U.S. remained during the dialogue, changes have already become very apparent to the relationship.
On the updated strategic dialogue between China and the U.S., the old problems remains. During a meeting with President Trump in Washington, Chinese State Councilor Yang Jiechi once again expressed China's willingness to work together with the U.S. over the Korean Peninsula crisis, but the U.S. shows no appreciation on China's due suspension proposal, which calls the U.S. to stop military exercises in the region.
That's something that will continue, and it's something that I can't imagine that we would give up on, something as important as that, those joint exercises.
The two-day meeting is one of the 4 high-level mechanisms established during the Mar-a-Lago meeting between the two countries' presidents in April. Although issues such as the South China Sea, trade friction, and the U.S. military presence in the Asia-Pacific distress China-U.S. ties, solving the DPRK issue overrides the rest. Recently, the DPRK again said it was open to talks with the U.S. if they stop military drills on the peninsula. Next Thursday, the new South Korean President Moon Jae-in visits Washington. He is also looking for de-escalating tension, but wants a Korean-led process.
And now I'm joined in the studio in Beijing for World Insight with Tian Wei, Richard Haass, President of Council on Foreign Relations and also author of the book, A World in Disarray. Welcome, sir.
It's good to be with you.
China-U.S. bilateral dialogue on security diplomacy just concluded. What do you, as a Washington insider certainly for decades, make of the result?
In some ways, we won't really know the results for several weeks, months, or even years.
What do you mean? Are you saying there's no clear result?
I would say there is no clear result. What matters, 90% of life is what I would call implementation. So it doesn't matter what the chemistry is across the table so much of what really happens. For example, can the United States and China narrow their differences over North Korea? Can they narrow their differences over the South China Sea? Can they avoid major problems in the area of trade? Those are the real questions, much more than the immediate mood of the conversation.
Well, we ask those questions every day, sir, on our program. So let's go a little bit narrow it down to some specific topics. DPRK, there is a distrust on both sides. China wonder whether the United States thinking about regime change in the DPRK rather than anything else. And the United States worry about China, whether it's using DPRK as a leverage in the bilateral relations. What about that distrust? Without mending the fences on that, can the two countries really moving forward?
I wouldn't call it so much distrust, as we do have very different agendas here. But the United States...
What is your agenda?
As much as the United States detests this regime, and just recently we saw the murder, essentially, of a young American man, the United States is also prepared to live with this regime. We have said our goal is not, our priority is not regime change. Our priority is to see change in capabilities and policy, essentially, for North Korea, to stop and ultimately get rid of its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities, to reduce the conventional threat it poses to South Korea.
But regime change, is that the mean to get there?
No, I think the United States has made clear that we are prepared to live with this regime so long as it changes what it has and what it does.
When you say we, what kind of we are you referring to? Was it the Obama administration or the Trump administration?
This has been a consistent point of view of the United States now for several decades.
What about military strike? Because President Trump so far has never ruled out a military strike.
And we should not rule out a military strike. It has to be one of the options. The preferred option is a diplomatic option where North Korea would be persuaded, and this is where China comes in. China has more influence over North Korea than any other external country, more even than the United States. So our preference, and the United States and President Trump has made this clear to President Xi Jinping, is China use more of its influence in order to bring about a clear change in North Korean behavior.
China said it many times. DPRK is a sovereign nation, and China, even though having decades of relationship with DPRK, could only having certain impact on it by influencing, let's just say, economic and trade ties with it. And yet it could not make a decision for the country, as you may know very well. So to what leverage China could have at what different times if Pyongyang really wants to talk to Washington?
I speak for myself. I don't speak for Mr. Trump. I would not be opposed to the United States speaking to North Korea directly if I were persuaded it would accomplish some good. But coming back to your basic point, China has much more influence over North Korea than it admits to. I'm not saying it can control North Korea. As you say, North Korea is a sovereign country. North Korea has the ability to push back. But, and it's an important but, most of North Korea's economy depends on things going in and out through China. China, again, has far more influence than it's prepared to use. The reason is China wants to keep North Korea intact. North Korea poses a strategic dilemma for China. China doesn't like what North Korea is doing with its nuclear weapons. China understands that this is a threat to China and the region. Beijing is closer to North Korea than many other capitals in the region. So Beijing has something to worry about, the loss of command and control over nuclear weapons. But China is also reluctant to use all of its influence because it doesn't want to destabilize North Korea. That is China's strategic dilemma here.
There is another strategic dilemma it seems China is facing, that is whether Washington and Pyongyang can talk to one another, because at this point there has to be, as even in your previous answer, a sequencing that you're talking about. That DPRK has to commit it to a certain extent that it's accessible to the others, that it is going to give up the nuclear weapons before Washington would like to talk to
I don't
Pyongyang.
think so.
What exactly is it?
Well, again, I don't speak for the government. I don't think anyone is saying North Korea has to give up its nuclear weapons before we would talk. That's the principal thing we would talk about.
Right.
But it can't use talks as a cover, as a protection to buy time in order to continue to develop
How would
nuclear
you judge?
weapons. We would need to have inspections. And I would argue that we would need to have some kind of a freeze in place as a prerequisite for talks.
So you're saying
There would have to be intrusive inspections. There would have to be significant limits on what North Korea do. I think the long-term goal should remain the same. I think the long-term goal should be North Korea not having nuclear weapons, not having ballistic missiles. But I think in the short run, we should be prepared to accept other outcomes, and I think it's fair to ask what would we do in return. And I would say I would be prepared to talk to North Korea directly. I would be prepared to reduce, not eliminate, reduce certain economic sanctions. And again, I would be prepared to put on as a distant goal or as a longer-term goal, getting rid of all their nuclear weapons in the short, in exchange for putting a freeze in the short run.
one of the things that we all know in international politics is the degrees that you move and how the other side would respond to you, the interactions. And that has a lot to do with the North Korea government. There are concerns whether there has been too much possibility for them to play with. There are also other concerns as to whether they will be eventually cornered and eventually take actions that nobody wants to see. So what about that degree of negotiation, degrees of actions and interactions?
Look, we've been having this conversation about how to deal with North Korea for 20, 25 years.
Yes, without much results so
Exactly right. So right now, I'm more worried about doing too little than too much.
You know, how much of your words and your suggestions likely to get across to the White House, particularly the eventual decision? There were some media reports earlier before you're arriving here in Beijing suggesting you are one of those very few on the Council on Foreign Relations that President Trump would like to lend his ears to. So let me ask you about that very strategic question.
Look, all I can do is say what I say and write what I say, write what I write. It's up to other people to decide whether the ideas I put forward, the advice I give is worth taking. When you're on the outside of government, the most you have is influence. You don't have power. You only have power, potentially, if you're inside government. I am outside government, so I speak to people in the administration regularly, but they get many sources of advice. They have to decide if...
What is happening to our world order? After World War II, a very established system seems to have been established and everybody had followed the rules for decades, but it seems that the United States itself wants to destruct it for now. For example, about isolationism, for example, about not necessarily contributing to the UN when it comes to its funding. So, Mr. Haass, what do you think is going on? The destruction of the already existing system or the likely born of a new one?
We need to think about what will it take to introduce greater amounts of order in this global world we live in. So we'll take a combination of some specific approaches. We do this in the Middle East, or this with North Korea, or this with Russia and Europe. But more importantly, we need to say, what kind of arrangements do we need to manage globalization? And I have ideas that I've put forward in this book about how countries have to now take on new obligations.
How will United States play its role in the still existing international order? It's a big question. What is your observation?
It's a big question, and until recently, I thought I had the answer. And obviously, Mr. Trump represents something of a departure. He's different than his predecessor, and he's less willing.
It's not just him. The voters voted him into the White House, even though you could say it's male, white, usually not college educated, but they still voted him into the White House. That's your president.
Obviously, he's my president. And what we've seen in the United States is a certain turning away from international responsibility, I think in part after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen all three candidates at the end of the last election were against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So things that we used to take for granted in the United States, I don't think we can quite take for granted anymore. And
what are those things?
Well, about American support for alliances, American support for free trade, American support for certain types of international arrangements. I think a lot of these things now are being more hotly debated than they were for some time.
The question is, will these international orders go their own path without the participation, or at least active participation, of the United States? Or are we going to see, as a result of this, the establishment of different kinds of diversified, let 100 flower blossom, as they say, different kinds of mechanisms, and will they be able to work together?
The answer is no, and you'll have
Which one?
You'll have 100 things blossom, but many will not be flowers. Many will be weeds. This is going to be a much messier world. The world can't organize itself without the United States.
For now.
Forever. I do not see any other country able, ready, and willing to step into the shoes of the United States. The United States can't do it alone, but I don't see the world being able to do it without us. So without the United States playing a leading role, I think we're much more likely to see larger elements of disorder. We already see it in the Middle East. We've seen some of it in Europe. I think we very likely could see it in Asia. We will obviously see it at the global level.
But some say it is exactly because some kinds of inappropriate role played by the United States that have led to where we are. For example, the Middle East. We didn't expect there should be a war in Iraq, and the United Nations didn't stand for that. We all remember that debate back in 2003. In Asia as well, you see there has been some times of order in the South China Sea, unless the U.S. want to use it as a leverage by moving its allies against China. And there seems to be some quiet down right now, sir. So many are saying in this region, please, United States and China, don't let us choose where to stand. That's going to be tragedy for all of us. So can the U.S. be out of here in terms of not to use it as a leverage?
It's not a question of leverage. China should welcome our presence in this part of the world.
China did welcome
and
the
it should
presence.
continue to. Because without the United States here, without our alliance relationships, you would have far more independent centers of power. You would have proliferation of nuclear weapons in places you don't see it now. You would much more likely have conflict. So China should be one of the big advocates for the United States maintaining a large role in the Asia-Pacific.
What about the Middle East?
Middle East, again, we have made at times mistakes. I was against the Iraq War. But right now, for example, I think we were right in using force in Syria recently after the Syrian government used chemical weapons. And I think now what we are doing is defeating terrorists there. And one of the questions will be, who will take control of territory that the terrorists lose? Do we want it to be Syria, the Syrian government in Iran or Russia? Or do we want it to be forces associated with the United States?
Some also argue about that. They're also saying, well, probably the U.S. was playing too much role earlier. For example, before the Iraq War, leading up to the war. But now, U.S. is playing too little role because the U.S. did not want to shoulder the part of the responsibility it should.
I've said just that. I said we, in some ways, in 2003, I thought we tried to do too much in transforming the Middle East. I think more recently under President Obama, at times we tried to do too little. And we've got, like the nursery tale, we've got to get it right. And I think now what this administration is struggling to do, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not, is to get it right inside the Middle East and also between the Middle East and the rest of the world. We don't want our involvement in the Middle East to become so large that we don't have the attention to deal with Asia, to deal with Europe, to deal with Latin America, Africa, and to deal with global issues.
Once again, who will decide on that degree?
Well, that's why you, more than anyone else, it'll be the president.
That's right.
Under the American system, the president has tremendous freedom of choice when it comes to foreign policy.
Do you think yes, indeed, but do you think that the president, when busying with some of the Washington politics and also scandals about himself, be able to make the right choices? Or domestic politics is actually going to direct all the directions of the foreign policy, which is likely to be very dangerous, Mr. Haass?
I think he will have the freedom to make the choices when it comes to foreign policy. Whether he'll make what I consider to be, or you consider to be, the right choices is another matter. But I don't think the various quote-unquote scandals, the investigations, I don't think they prevent him from carrying out an intelligent and successful foreign policy.
And the other danger people see also is whether the president, under enormous political pressure, likely to do something in order to rally the crowd, to come back to the politics center, and yet not necessarily going to be, in the long term, a beneficial policy for the United States' own interest and for the others as well.
I've heard that suggestion. It just seems to me it's incredibly risky. One of the things that history shows is it's much easier to begin things than it is to end them or predict how they will unfold. So any president has to be extraordinarily careful, particularly when it comes to the life of the American men and women in uniform. So again, I've worked for 4 presidents, and every time I've been up close to a president, he's been extraordinarily careful and extraordinarily aware of the responsibilities he brings to the Oval Office.
In politics, we see an apparent trend of strongman politics. You see that in Russia, in Turkey, and some of the other developed economies as well. Of course, President Trump is a very different type when it comes to strongman. So after observing the governance of 4 presidents in your own country and our contemporary history, Mr. Haass, where is politics these days?
I think it's very
Is it bringing us up or bringing us down?
It's a really good question. I worry about it. And I think that the pressures on politicians is growing. One area we haven't talked about is as jobs disappear because of new technology, artificial intelligence, robots, driverless vehicles, I worry that populism will grow and it will be harder and harder to govern in the United States, in Europe, and China. Well, you asked about the quality of leadership, the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship. There are those who say it's inevitable we're going to become adversaries. I don't believe that. But the quality of leadership in China, in the United States, will make a tremendous difference. There's almost nothing inevitable about history. People and ideas are what make history. So we have to hope that we have quality leadership in China and the United States over the coming decades, because again, this will be the critical relationship of the 21st century.
It's always wonderful to see you, Mr. Haass, and hear your ideas and insights on World Insight with Tian Wei.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight with Tian Wei, CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.